Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, and also a lecturer in Princeton's Politics Department. He has written extensively in recent years on issues of race in America, which he approaches from the perspective of classical liberalism and what he calls theocentric humanism. He's written a book called Wounds That Will Not Heal, subtitled Affirmative Action and Our Continuing Racial Divide. Russell Neely, welcome to today's Issues.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you, Russell. I'm Tim here with Ray. So Ray just described your background there, or your credentials. So you're currently at Princeton University?
Yeah, I'm a part-time lecturer in the politics department, plus I work with the James Madison Program, which is a program that seeks to draw attention to the American founding era and the principles of the Constitution and of the founding era in general.
So when Ray said that you're looking at this issue of race in America from a classical liberalism, are you a liberal?
A classical liberal. Here we go. This is a great deal of confusion. Almost every country in the world you go to, except the United States, if you say you're a liberal, it means you hold the kinds of views that James Madison held, that
Right.
Thomas Jefferson held, that Adam Smith held. You believe in personal freedom and individual responsibility and an open market, entrepreneurially driven economy. In America, the term liberal has come to mean what in Europe would be called a social democrat or a democratic socialist. So it's very confusing. So people who hold the view of Madison or Adam Smith, we have to call ourselves classical liberals to distinguish ourselves from its American usage. We wouldn't have to use that if we go to Europe or South America. If we say we're liberals or neoliberals, people understand that to mean free enterprise, free market-oriented liberals, rather than what liberalism means in the United States, where essentially it's a form of democratic socialism rather than liberalism in the original sense.
And it mentions here that you're a proponent of what you call theocentric humanism. What's that all about?
Well, the term theocentric humanism was popularized by Jacques Maritain, who was the most important Catholic political theorist in the early post-World War II era, and he was distinguishing theocentric humanism from what he called anthropocentric humanism. And theocentric humanism is the only full and true humanism, Maritain said, because human beings are fully human only when we recognize the spiritual or transcendental or a godlike aspect of their personality. And theocentric humanism was very well represented during the civil rights movement by the Black Church and people like Martin Luther King, who said we're created in the image of God. That's theocentric humanism.
Well, would you say something? Let's go right to the issue then of racial preference policies, because you point out that they came about connected somehow to the urban riots of the late 1960s. So go back to the beginning and just connect that to history and tell us, at least when viewed through the most optimistic lens, what were they hoping to accomplish through racial preference policies?
Well, the urban riots in the late 60s convinced a lot of policy planners in the federal government, in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, for instance, in the Department of Labor, as well as many leaders in the leading law schools and elite Ivy League schools, that more had to be done to deal with the alienation of blacks in America than could be achieved through the colorblind ideal that had inspired so much of the earlier 1950s and 60s civil rights movement. So they moved essentially from a colorblind ideal that we're all Americans, we're all in this together, we're all created as children of God, to a highly color-conscious form of distributing the burdens and the rewards of citizenship. And it was initially the racial preference policies which came into existence in which included preferences in employment, in hiring, and in set-asides, which is a form of federal contracting, as well as preferences in university admissions. Initially, these were defended on the basis of what we might call compensatory justice. The thinking was, well, black people have been so terribly mistreated, they deserve to be compensated for the mistreatment, in the same way that we demand the return of stolen goods. That understanding of racial preference policy, however, was rejected in the Bakke case, which in the late 70s, dealing with preferences in admission to a California medical school. And Lewis Powell, the justice, in his decision, said that compensatory justice is not a legitimate reason for giving for racial preferencing, at least in state-run institutions. However, diversity enhancement is a legitimate reason for overriding the normal imperative towards color blindness. And ever since the Bakke decision, when people defend racial preferences, certainly in university admissions, they defend them on the grounds of diversity enhancement rather than compensatory justice. In my judgment, neither of those justifications, neither compensatory justice nor diversity enhancement, can really carry the weight of abandoning the colorblind ideal. And if we have a little more time, I can go into just why I say that.
Well, yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, let me tell you, the book is called Wounds That Will Not Heal, and it's subtitled Affirmative Action and Our Continuing Racial Divide. Russell Neely is our guest, Nieli. He is a professor. Professor of what?
Just a lecturer in politics at Princeton University.
Yes, at Princeton University. Okay, yes, continue on that line of thinking you were going with.
Yeah, I was saying why neither the compensatory justice rationale nor the diversity enhancement rationale really holds up to criticism when we look at actual racial preference policies. My book concentrates primarily, not exclusively, on preferences, racial preferences that are given in university admissions and admissions to professional schools and graduate schools. And here's the problem for the diversity enhancement rationale. The way it works is this. If you are white or Asian and you have, let's say, a 600 on your SATs, or your daughter or your son has 600 on their SATs, they're probably going to get into schools where most other people have 600 on the SATs. If you're black, you probably will get into schools where the other students have 700 on their SATs. That there's a huge, huge boost given for being black, a somewhat lesser one for being Hispanic. And as I say, the difference is huge. It's a form of what I call upward ratcheting. If you're white and Asian and you would have gotten into, let's say, a Tier 5 school, well, if you're black or Hispanic, you'll get into a Tier 4 school. If you would have gotten into a Tier 4 school, if you're white or Asian, with the same scores, you'll get into a Tier 3 school if you're black or Hispanic. So you have this upward ratcheting. Blacks and Hispanics, particularly blacks, are always placed, or often placed, in institutions that are 1 or 2 or 3 levels of selectivity beyond the ones they would have gotten into based on their high school record. Now, what this does, first of all, from the standpoint of diversity enhancement, one school's diversity gain is always purchased at the expense of another's diversity loss, insofar as the number of black students and Hispanic students who go to college is fairly fixed. The question is not whether they're going to get into college, but which college they're going to get into. And when you have an upward ratcheting system as we have, the higher tiered schools take students who, in the black or Hispanic students who in the absence of preferences would have gotten into lower tiered schools, and thus they deprive the students of the lower tiered school of the diversity enhancement value of those students. So it's not clear from a diversity enhancement perspective whether racial preferences and the upward ratcheting system that it's produced really does enhance diversity. But what is clear is that it tends to substitute for good diversity, bad diversity. And let me explain that. it's certainly true that under certain circumstances, if you bring people from diverse perspectives together, they can mutually enrich one another. They can learn from one another. They can find out what they have in common. But other circumstances, unfavorable circumstances, often leads to the very opposite. And it's just not true that if you bring people together, they're always going to get along with each other and cooperate. And what the social science has shown for the last 30 or 40 years, that to overcome prejudices and to get people to work together, it's important that people are of the same, what they call a status, social status. If you want a community, you're not going to get white people and black people to see eye to eye, and if the black people are all poor and the white people are all middle class. On the other hand, if they're all middle class and they have a lot in common, the diversity and the contact between the people can often build these sorts of bridges and mutual understanding. What the upward ratcheting system does is it guarantees that the typical black or Hispanic student on a highly competitive college campus will not be the academic equivalent of the typical white or Asian student. The typical white or Asian student is going to be much better qualified and have had higher test scores and gotten higher grades in high school. And what that does, of course, is to create a kind of a segregated student body. And students come to think of themselves as part of a racially superior or racially inferior group in terms of their academic preparation. And this has a terribly harmful effect in terms of bridging a gulf between different races. It tends to enhance self-segregation. If you go to almost any college campus, or any high school for that matter, you'll see a great deal of self-segregation. Blacks hang out with blacks, whites with whites, Asians with Asians, Arabs with Arabs. But the current system of racial preferences greatly enhances that self-segregation because those who have made the grade and have gotten into a competitive college under a higher standard tend to look upon themselves as part of an intellectually superior race, and those who have gotten in under lower standards see themselves as part of an intellectually inferior race. And it just reinforces negative stigmas and negative stereotypes that already exist in the general culture, but it reinforces them in a very powerful way. So if you're trying to create a community on college campuses, if you're trying to get people to mutually enrich each other by their backgrounds and so on, the last thing you want to do is to have a dual admission system where some people have to make it under a much higher academic standard to get admitted to a competitive university than someone else here. Think of it this way. Let's say that for whatever reason universities wanted to increase the number of short women on their campuses. And to do that, they made being a short woman, if you're a woman and you're 5'2" or shorter, will give you 100 points on each of your SAT scores. If you average 500, we'll make it as if you average 600. And plus, we'll boost your grades in your high school courses substantially. If you're a B student, we'll consider you an A- student. If you're a B+, we'll consider you a straight A student. Well, what would happen on the university campuses is, as people see short women, they're going to say, one of those dumb shorties, just as they do with athletes, recruited athletes. When universities, as many do, reach way down academically for athletes, you have the image of the dumb jock. And this also leads to self-segregation. The recruited athletes tend to hang out with each other. They know they haven't been accepted to highly competitive universities because they're the sharpest intellects on campus, and they tend to form their own subcultures and subgroups. And the same thing happens with African Americans on elite universities. So the diversity enhancement rationale is just not sufficient to justify departure from what I think is a very important general rule, and that is color blindness. Now, the second justification given that isn't used in constitutional adjudication because Justice Powell didn't accept it is the compensatory justice. The problem with the compensatory justice rationale in terms of justifying preferences for black students is that the affirmative action programs, the racial preference programs, are almost never means tested. The people who tend to get into the Ivy League schools, they tend to be the black students who get into Ivy League schools. They tend to be generally from middle to upper middle class backgrounds, and nowadays a large portion of them are immigrant blacks from the Caribbean or from Africa who are no part of the American experience, were no part of the American slavery experience or the Jim Crow experience. So obviously they don't deserve compensation. So the compensatory justice rationale doesn't work there either. And I've given just a small fraction of what I say in my book about the many harms and difficulties with current racial preference policy.
Well, let me ask one follow-up question, because the subtitle of the book is Affirmative Action and Our Continuing Racial Divide, which the last part of that everybody understands there is a continuing racial divide, and we're 40 years into this racial preference policy experiment. Would it be fair to say then, on the basis of your research, that you think these racial preference policies really have done nothing to bridge that racial divide, but perhaps have even continued or even increased the racial divide in America?
The latter, but I wouldn't even say perhaps. That they definitely have enormously increased the racial the saliency of the racial divide. They've had the exact opposite effect in terms of harming the forces that tend to lead to greater racial understanding and racial cooperation. And I think, I mean, this if one reads the rhetoric of the 1950s and early 60s era civil rights movement, you'll see the importance of the understanding that we should get away from race. We should think of ourselves as children of God. We're all created in the image of God. We must be treated accordingly. This was said again and again, and not just by black ministers, but Lyndon Johnson. I have a quote in my book. Lyndon Johnson, when he signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he went out of his way to use religious rhetoric here to say this is the way we break down the barriers between race and race, ethnicity and ethnicity, is to assert what I'm calling theocentric humanism, that we are part there. There's Christians, of course, say following Galatians that there is no Jew or Greek. We're all the same in Christ Jesus. And even if you're not a Christian, Jews will say, well, yeah, we're all descendants of the Adam and Eve of a single parent. We're all part of the same extended family. All this very important colorblind religious lost. And I think affirmative action has greatly harmed racial relations in America.
We're out of time, unfortunately. A very interesting topic to cover. Wounds That Will Not Heal, Affirmative Action and Our Continuing Racial Divide, written by our guest Russell Neely, N-I-E-L-I, and it's published by Encounter Books. And what's the? Do you have a website?
My book's available on Amazon. I don't have a special website. But anyway, this is my book. You can get it just from Amazon or Barnes and Noble.
Okay. And well, listen, Russell, thanks so much for your time today, and we appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
All right, very well.